Inquietação.
Inquietação.
É só inquietação.
É só inquietação.
Inquietação. É só inquietação, inquietação.
Há sempre qualquer coisa que está para acontecer.
Inquietação, inquietação. É só inquietação, inquietação. Porque não sei, porque não sei, porque não sei.
Princípio da Inquietação, o podcast para filosofar, porque não sei ainda. Bem-vindo a mais um episódio do Princípio da Inquietação. Hoje vamos poder escutar uma filósofa norte-americana que se tem destacado pelo seu trabalho sobre Hannah Arendt. Foi responsável pela tradução, em 2024, de uma coletânea de poesia de Arendt. É professora visitante no Oxford Center for Life Writing. O seu próximo livro sobre a solidão será publicado pela Yale University Press. Vamos agora ouvi-la sobre ideologia e terror. A pergunta que procurou responder na sua intervenção no Espanto Festival Internacional de Filosofia foi a de saber se a solidão será a condição subjacente a todos os movimentos totalitários. Princípio da Inquietação, o podcast para filosofar, porque não sei ainda. Espanto, Festival Internacional de Filosofia. Este ano vamos pensar sobre o desejo. Entre os dias 13 e 28 de junho, em Cascais. Garanta já o seu lugar.
So I want to begin and end today with a question. And it is the question that I find myself continuously returning to. Where do you get your meaning from? Where do you get your meaning from? Hannah Arendt didn't care about the facts. One of the questions that I often get asked is why her work is so relevant today and feels so prescient to our times. I never give the honest answer to this question. I always try to sound poetic or make it, relate to the concepts and her work itself. But I think the answer to this question is actually pretty simple. And I think it's pretty human. Hannah Arendt understood that at the end of the day, the facts don't matter. What matters is storytelling. As human beings, as human animals, we are storytellers. And we get our meaning, individually and collectively, from the stories we tell. And we tell our stories with the language that we have. Now, we all come into the world and inherit a certain vocabulary. It is our job, Hannah Arendt argued, to rethink this vocabulary anew. And so now I'm going to talk about Hannah Arendt. In 1933, after the burning of the Reichstag, Hannah Arendt said, "I want nothing more to do with intellectuals." I feel this very deeply these days. I want nothing more to do with that milieu. I want nothing more to do with those professional thinkers. Why? Because when the chips are down, it turns out that the people least equipped to deal with the political realities we face are the professional thinkers. And so she turned away from her promising academic career as a young philosopher, working on her second book, A History of Jewish Assimilation and German Romanticism, in order to do political work. And she said that she was only going to do political work for her people, her mother had taught her as a young girl that when you are attacked as a Jew, you defend yourself as a Jew. And so she wanted to help the Jewish people. She put down her books. She put down her habilitation on Rahel Varnhagen, and she began collecting anti-Semitic statements from newspapers at the Prussian State Library. At the same time, she turned her apartment into an underground stop to help communists fleeing. One day, walking out of the library, on her way to meet her mother for lunch, she was arrested by the Gestapo. Why? A librarian reported her for reading too many newspapers. What does an academic have to do with so many newspapers? Hannah Arendt was held in the basement of Alexanderplatz in Berlin for 8 days, not knowing if she would make it out, not knowing what was going to happen. In a 1964 interview with Günter Gauss on German national television, she said that she was only able to escape by chance because she seduced the young guard who was put in charge of her care. The next day, she fled. She spent the next 8.5 years in France doing work for Jewish organizations, primarily Youth Aliyah, helping Jewish youth escape to then Palestine, and went to Palestine in 1935. She said she didn't want anything to do with the kibbutzim. She didn't want to live there. She went back to Paris, divorced her first husband, fell in love with her second husband, got remarried, and 3 months later was forced to report for internment. She and her husband were sent to separate camps. She didn't know where Heinrich Blücher was. She didn't know where her husband was. She was sent to Gurs in the south of France. It's the only time in her life she thought about suicide. She didn't know what was going to happen. She didn't know if she was going to be able to escape. And after 5.5 weeks, she was part of a mass escape with 62 other women who had forged exit papers inside the camp. And she walked out alone, on foot, across France, to first find her friend Walter Benjamin, who she stayed with for 2 weeks before getting word of where refugees were gathering in Montbon. So she went there, hopeful she'd meet her husband, and after a few weeks, she saw him by chance, standing in the middle of the street, next to a pile of mattresses. With the help of Arian Fry, they were able to secure American emergency exit visas. And on May 22nd, 1941, she arrived in New York City, 35 years old, $25 in her pocket, and she did not speak English except for a few lines of Shakespeare, or so she claims. She spent her first summer as a housekeeper to learn English. And in the fall of 1941, she went to Columbia University, where she met Salo Baron, who founded the first Jewish studies program in the United States. And he offered her a chance to write for social studies. This was the beginning of her writing career. Between 1941 and 1951, she worked on what became the origin. And I'm telling you this story, I'm telling you this bit of biography, because I want you to hold it in your mind while I talk about the origins of totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt published The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951. It was the first major account of the rise of Hitlerism and Stalinism. When Donald Trump was elected president in 2016, The Origins of Totalitarianism became a #1 bestseller. And so that's the question I get. Why are we reading a book published in 1951 to understand what is happening today in the 21st century? And the answer is because of the story Hannah Arendt tells. It is not because she is a good historian. I can assure you of that. And it's not because she was obsessed with the facts. She doesn't offer a linear history. She doesn't say A happened, so B happened, so C happened. Therefore, the rise of totalitarianism was inevitable. For her, this would somehow mean that we could predict the future. And nobody can predict the future. The only tense is the present tense, the now. So she wanted to provide another framework for thinking about how totalitarianism phenomenally emerged at a certain moment in time. And so the book, which is really 3 books, a history of anti-Semitism, a history of imperialism, and then a history of totalitarianism as it emerges in real time, she wanted to tell a story about how the elements had crystallized into the appearance of these totalitarian political movements. And so the book draws together the different elements: anti-Semitism and racism. In the 19th century, Hannah Arendt argues that the nature of anti-Semitism changes. And anti-Semitism becomes a political instrument. It becomes a political instrument to do the work of the state. It no longer has anything to do with the hatred of Jewish people. Anti-Semitism becomes a canary in the coal mine for collapsing democracies. She talks about the emergence of the nation state as a distinct political institution that comes into existence in the 19th century concomitantly alongside imperialism and colonialism. Politics become economics, economics become politics, or as she puts it in the book, businessmen became politicians and politicians were only taken seriously if they spoke the language of businessmen. Businessmen had liberated themselves from their private economic affairs because they needed the apparatus of the state in order to further their colonial ventures. You can't just colonize a people. You need the military in order to take land, in order to expropriate resources. You need the state. You need the military. And then she describes what today we would call blowback theory. When you engage in these wars of imperialism and colonialism, you do not just dismantle the fabric of another society. You end up dismantling and hollowing out the political institutions of the society you live in too. I never thought in my lifetime, having studied this for a living, that I would be witnessing the alignment between what is now called anti-Semitism and the new far right today. But here we are, watching the emergence of a new right-wing authoritarian movement around the world. In the third part of the book, Hannah Arendt talks about what she calls the process of radical evil. It's not the banality of evil, which might be the phrase you're familiar with. Radical evil is a 3-step process of dehumanization that is necessary in order to engage in this kind of right-wing authoritarian politics. The first step is that you kill the juridical person in man, which means you strip a people of their legal citizenship status, take away their citizenship rights, take away the right to, let's say, habeas corpus. The second step is that you make the people complicit in the crimes of the state by confusing their ability to distinguish between right and wrong. So overnight, she says, the moral norms of European civilization collapsed, and that old commandment, thou shalt not kill, became thou shalt kill for the security of the state. And people went along with it. Why? Where do you get your meaning from? At the end of the book, in the final sentences, published in 1951, she says that totalitarian solutions, totalitarian movements will continue to exist wherever people want simple solutions, simple stories for complex social, political, and economic problems. Let me give you an example. Donald Trump riding down a golden escalator. You can't pay your bills? You can't get ahead at work? You can't find a job? You don't feel like you have community? You don't feel like you can talk to anyone? You don't feel like there's anyone there to listen to you? They're the problem. They're the problem. I'm going to get rid of them, and then I'll get rid of the problem. This story is so old. The story is so old, it hurts to retell it up here today. And what she says at the end of Origins in 1951, she comes back to in 1958, which is the title of my talk today, Ideology and Terror. She rewrites the conclusion. And she wants to understand the nature and the power of those simple stories. And so she writes a Festschrift for her teacher, Karl Jaspers, the great German existentialist philosopher. She writes it in German. It's the only part of the book written in German. She wrote it in English, and then it was translated into German, which she had a hand in, but this is the only part written in German. And she argues that the underlying conditions of totalitarian movements are homelessness, rootlessness, and what in English has been translated to as loneliness. And this is probably the most famous quote from the book today, and this is where it comes from. Loneliness is the underlying condition of all totalitarian movements. We've taken one of the most terrifying experiences of the human condition and made it so much a part of everyday life that we now live in a world where people are isolated and afraid of each other all the time. But here's the problem. She doesn't use the word loneliness. In German, you might use the word Einsamkeit to say either solitude or loneliness, much like Solidão in Portuguese, I think. Thank you. I knew you would correct me. I love it. The word she uses is Verlassenheit. And she takes this word from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra in the chapter titled Heimkehr, or Return Home, in which Zarathustra, having descended the mountain and suffered among the masses, goes back up the mountain and says, "Oh, loneliness, my loneliness, I've missed you." Einsamkeit, solitude, as we would understand it, the pleasurable experience of keeping company with oneself. And he calls being among the masses Verlassenheit, meaning when one is submerged, as we might say, in the crowd, they feel abandonment, self-abandonment. And this takes me to the core of Hannah Arendt's work and back to our question. Where do you get your meaning from? What are the stories that you are telling yourself about what is happening in the world today? Because that story is going to shape how you act. Where does thinking come from? Experience and nothing else, Hannah Arendt said at a conference on Hannah Arendt in 1972. This means that each and every single one of us goes out into the world and we experience the world through our senses. I see you. I can smell you. I can smell myself. Can taste, touch, hear. And then I go home. And maybe I sit on my couch and I think about this wonderful conference that Katerina has organized, and I tell myself a story about the experience that I've had here today. And then I go back out into the world and I say, oh God, let me tell you about my experience at this conference. I had so many interesting conversations with people about fear and courage and loneliness. And then you share your experience with me. And together we weave the web of human relations. But Hannah Arendt called this factual truth. This is factual truth. And she's cheeky. She never uses words the way that you might expect her to use them. She calls it factual truth because it's the easiest kind of truth to destroy. It's the easiest kind of truth to destroy because you can say, that didn't happen, you're full of shit. You can deny my experience. You can deny my experience. And then I start questioning myself. Well, did I really hear that? Did I really see that? And I stop trusting myself. Self-abandonment. Self-abandonment. This is the function of political propaganda. This is the function of what Hannah Arendt calls ideology. This is how ideology works. Ideology is literally the logic of an idea, which becomes a framework for interpreting experience. I think of the myth of Procrustes, who was a thief and a murderer, and he would take his victims back to his house, and he would lay them down in a metal bed. And if their limbs were too short, he'd stretch them out and rack them, and they'd die. And if they were too long, he'd cut off whatever was hanging over, and they would die. This is how ideology works to shape our perception of the world. And let me tell you, we are living in extremely ideological times. Everyone wants to tell you how to think. Everyone wants you to pass an ideological purity test to prove that you are on the right side of history, because ideology only knows one movement, and that's forward. The question that Hannah Arendt writes in her journal is there a way of thinking that is not tyrannical? And then she writes, the point is to not get swept up in the tide at all. Ideology is the tide. Ideology is the tide that turns you away from your experience of being in the world as a unique human being that lives with others. Instead of asking yourself what your experience was, you look here, you look there, you Google, maybe you talk to ChatGPT now, you look to the doctrine of the political movement or political party that you belong to, and they will tell you how to think. And here's the truly insidious part of this, is that it teaches you not only not to trust yourself, so that you're constantly forced to look outside yourself, it teaches you not to trust anyone else. And so we are perpetually isolated in ourselves against one another, suspicious and cynical, looking back to the ideology to confirm that we have made the right choice, that we have said the right thing, that we have been politically correct, that we have not stepped on anyone's toes. And it teaches you that there is a truer reality beyond the reality of yourself. And you only need the ideology to discern, to determine what is happening. Where do you get your stories from? Where do you get your meaning from? When the chips are down, as Hannah Arendt used to say, you have to make a decision. And she writes this in Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship. It's the clearest answer she gives to the question. When the choice became murder or murder, when the moral norms were overturned overnight, some people decided to resist. Some people decided to act. Some people were willing to die. Some people were willing to go to jail. Some people were willing to violate the social norms in order to do what they felt was right. Not because they were looking outside themselves, but because they were asking whether or not they were in harmony with themselves. The difference between people who decide to act, she says, and people who decide to resist is that people who decide to resist choose to think. And this is where I come to fear. Courage, she writes in The Human Condition, is the political virtue par excellence. Why? Because when you step into the public and you speak, you can be told you're wrong. You can be killed. You can feel terror. It takes courage to speak. It takes courage to speak in dark times. It takes courage to act. Her final work, The Life of the Mind, Thinking, Willing, Judging, nobody ever reads the second book. Second book's the most important book. Thinking. Socrates is the political thinker par excellence, the gadfly wandering around the agora, teasing, conversation. Thinking for Hannah Arendt is a two-in-one conversation that I have with myself, between my self-consciousness and my conscience, which are those moral underpinnings of the self. And in that state of thinking, I'm in a state of solitude. I am keeping pleasurable company with myself. And I think we all probably know what it's like to feel out of sync with ourselves, to have done something and not really wanted to do it, and then you feel some kind of inner discomfort. This isn't where we stop evil. The negative claim that she makes in the book is that if it's possible to stop evil doing in the world, it has to happen somewhere in the thinking process, somewhere in the inner life of the mind. And the answer really comes in the book on willing. Unlike thinking, which is a state of harmony and solitude and pleasure, willing is that inner state of feeling torn apart. I don't know what to do. I feel drawn in this direction. I feel drawn in that direction. Is this right? Is that right? And this becomes even harder when we are constantly inundated with arguments and social pressure and the need to perform publicly and the need to appear like we're doing the right thing. And we feel torn. But it's there in the will, in that moment before you decide. It's there that freedom exists. That, for Arendt, is natality. It is the promise that the world can always be other than it is when you decide to act. When you decide to act. And you can't predict the future. Nobody knows what's going to happen. People who tell you that they know what's going to happen, run. Red flag, run. People who say, I've got a solution for that, run. People who want to sell you simple political stories, no. Where do you get your meaning from? Where do you get your meaning from? What is the story that you are telling yourself about what's happening right now? Where are you getting the story from? What's shaping the story? And I'm going to end on this, which is language, the material we use to tell stories. We need new language today. Everyone always asks me, well, the questions change. First it was, is America becoming a fascist country? And then 6 months ago it was, how did Hannah Arendt know it was time to leave Germany? And the past 2 months, the question has been, is there anything we can do? We desperately need new language to talk about what it's like to be alive right now. Because this is not 1933, this is not 1945, and this is not 1951. The nation state, which I think we'll probably hear about in the next talk, is a political institution that came into existence in the 19th century. It is not wobbly right now. It is bursting because our world today has been radically remade. We have never been more connected through travel, trade, and technology. We live, to use one of these words, a truly global society. And we are only going to become more interconnected. And what we are witnessing in the absence of political imagination, in the absence of a new language to tell new stories about a world that we could make together in common, is a doubling down on the political ideology and political rhetoric of the 19th century. A world not shaped by World War II, but by the inheritance of World War I. This is the kind of turning point that we are at right now. And so I'm staring at a clock. I've gone over and I'm going to stop, but it's ticking down. It's been ticking down at me the entire time. And somehow we've numbed ourselves to the political world we share by thinking we're always 5 minutes to midnight, by feeling like the clock is ticking down. There's no clock. The chips are on the table. The chips are on the table. And every single person in this room has to decide right now, today, how to act. Thank you.
Este episódio do Princípio da Inquietação foi gravado no Espanto, Festival Internacional de Filosofia, e editado pela Uncommon Waves. A identidade sonora é uma interpretação do músico e produtor Pedro Luís da obra Inquietação, da autoria de José Mário Branco, inspirada na versão interpretada pelo grupo Anaifa. A capa é de Tiago Pereira Santos, com fotografia do Espanto. A coordenação está a cargo de Joana Beleza e a direção é de João Vieira Pereira. Pode ouvir o Princípio da Inquietação em expresso.pt, na SIC e na SIC Notícias ou na sua plataforma de podcast. Voltamos na próxima semana.